Paradox of Morals by Nick Astreas. Introduction. This book is about the tension between human beings and their environment. More specifically, it is about the ways in which we experience a threat to our self-worth, a challenge to our value, from the very context in which we live, from the structure of the universe itself. Our environment mystifies and undermines, rather than clarifies and solidifies, the value of human life. As self-aware beings who know this, we therefore exist in a paradoxical situation. We walk against nature. We stand in opposition to our own context because it threatens us of our value. This conflict, because it is so fundamental, belongs at the center of any study of the human condition. Ernest Becker, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, reinterpreted the entire field of psychology through this one paradox. We are out of nature and hopelessly in it. Reinhold Niebuhr championed a form of Christian theology with this tension at its center. What a contradiction, he quipped in a 1955 sermon, to be the judge of all things and yet to be a worm of the earth. Henry Miller's writing combined the spiritual and the vulgar into a singular exaltation, which often landed upon this main theme. We walk against a united world, asserting our dividedness. Each of these three figures wrote about this timeless paradox in the modern era. All three of them concluded that the basic situation of human beings in the universe produces a natural opening toward religion, and all three tried to imagine what a vital religious pursuit might look like in the modern world. This book is attuned to the work of these three figures. The goal of Part 1 is to establish a foundation, to demonstrate that which makes the efforts of Becker, Niebuhr, and Miller intelligible in the first place. The universe is structured in such a way that it challenges us of our value. In Part 2, I attempt to summarize our basic responses to this problem, which are as timeless as the problem itself. However, like Becker, Niebuhr, and Miller, I'm mainly interested in our search for a solution in the modern, postmodern context. If I had to define the modern era broadly, in the terms of this book, I would define it as that period of time in which a sizable portion of humanity forgot that the universe presents a challenge to our value. Modern man is drinking and drugging himself out of awareness, or he spends his time shopping, which is the same thing, wrote Becker. Society contrives to help him forget. I will argue that our forgetfulness generally takes two forms. In one form, we forget about our value problem through a fanatic attempt to resolve it, through a myopic focus on our own creative power, which I would characterize as quintessentially modern. In the other form, we simply adopt a pretense of indifference, a sarcastic sense of apathy about the entire human predicament, which I would characterize as quintessentially postmodern. I will analyze these two conditions in chapters 4 and 7 respectively. Part 3 of this book is about the moral order of the universe. To be honest, I arrived at this topic unintentionally. In thinking through the central problem of this book, it just became obvious that the cosmic threat to our self-worth is intimately linked to our moral orientation. I realized that to write about the problem of human value is to write about the metaphysics of human values. As it so often does, Becker's insight rang true. You might say that the urge to morality is based entirely on the physical situation of the creature. This book is for people who sense that something is fundamentally wrong with modern society. Something about our way of life is essentially misguided. But we have drifted so far off course for so long that we no longer have a functioning language to identify what it is. We lack a common sense of orientation, a shared awareness of who and where we are, of what it is that we belong to. We have become a civilization devoid of context. Part 1. The Universe as Challenge to Human Value. It is bad to try to avoid tragedy if the price is to avoid truth. Chapter 1: Vastness and Restriction. At its heart, this is an elementary book. All of the basic premises in this book are introduced to us as children, in one way or another. They are the forces that produce, as Becker put it, the shock of the tiny child who is all at once, before the age of 6, suddenly turned into a philosopher, a tragedian. This book is about the threatening larger reality of our lives, the universe as challenge to human value. The basic premise of this chapter is that the sheer scale of the cosmos presents a challenge to the value of human ambitions. In 1935, after returning to New York from Paris, where he lived as an expatriate for several years, Miller wrote a letter to his friend Alfred Pearls, in which he took a moment to wonder about the airplane, about that obsession for the air which seems to have America by the balls. I want to ask you what it means, this business of flying to the moon, or Mars, or Jupiter. I ask myself very seriously if this flying mania is not the symptom of a very great and real distress, if it does not mean something more than just a conquest of the air, as they say. The aviator feels a sense of power not as of old, in touching the earth, but in freeing himself from the earth. This is dangerous. He will say to himself that it is his ambition to reach the moon, or Mars, or Jupiter, but he will never reach the moon. He will reach to himself again, to man, to a new fury of creative activity. Of course, now we actually have reached the moon, and it has only strengthened Miller's point. The moon landing was a symbolic achievement. It represented a new cycle of innovation, a new fury of creative activity. But once we got to the moon, our furious need to create, to do something new, to get somewhere else again, was not satisfied at all. What Miller recognized was the ultimate futility of a certain type of striving, an external ambition typified by the moon landing. They can blow things up to the most colossal proportions, make a network of cities which will obliterate the now intervening countryside. Still, it will make no difference. It is a horizontal movement, space-filling, and consequently futile. Miller's depiction of another old friend, Grover Waitress, speaks to this same point. I've met thousands of people, and none of them were alive in the way that Grover was. Grover was inexhaustible. He was like a bit of radium, which, even if buried under a mountain, does not lose its power to give off energy. Is the Earth getting anywhere? Grover must undoubtedly have asked himself this question, and must undoubtedly have satisfied himself that it was not getting anywhere. Who, then, had said that we must get somewhere? The question here is not whether our creative achievements, such as the airplane, might benefit society, but whether they, in themselves, signify any discernible movement against the cosmic backdrop, any discernible value on an ultimate level. Miller saw that they do not, and Grover showed him that to recognize this fact is potentially liberating. Grover satisfied himself that the Earth isn't getting anywhere, and he was inexhaustible. In Miller's letter to Pearls, he worries that his generation got lost in their excitement about flying. The awesomeness of their new creative achievement inspired them to go further, to get somewhere else again. But this mania also caused them to forget about how small and weak they ultimately are, how they aren't really getting anywhere. Mesmerized by their conquest of the air, they forgot about the larger reality surrounding their ambition. In reflection, neither the airplane nor the moon landing has affirmed the ultimate value of our external ambitions. And even if we build a colony on Mars, 1 trillion more planets are floating out there. The frontier is never ending, the interstellar spaces always looming over us. There will always be the sting of finitude behind every awesome accomplishment. To recognize this is to arrive at the simple point of this first chapter. The vast structure of the cosmos presents a challenge to the value of human ambitions. This is the essential point. The challenge is secure. We are insecure. As Miller observed, it is dangerous to feel a sense of power not in touching the earth, but in freeing ourselves from it. It becomes too easy to slip into fanatic optimism, to marvel at our freedom over nature, to believe in our own power to conquer the very context in which we live. In short, to imagine that human beings might one day, with enough fortitude, loom over the cosmos, whatever that could possibly mean. And this is why Niebuhr described religion as a final battleground between God and man's self-esteem. We can imagine the human drama as a battle between a species that says yes and a universe that says no. While this conflict is always happening in a million different ways, Niebuhr views religion as the arena for the final battle, the place where people go when they realize that life presents us with a problem that cannot be resolved, yet must be resolved, that we stand in opposition to our own context, that a war between the opposite sides of our own nature is inevitable and infinitely serious. The sociologist Robert Bellah concurred, writing that religion, as that symbolic form through which man comes to terms with the antinomies of his being, has not declined, indeed cannot decline, unless man's nature ceases to be problematic to him. In part 2 of this book, I will explain our primary strategies to get ourselves out of this battle, but let's review a couple of them briefly here. On one hand, to think that we can overcome our own environment through our own creative power is nothing but posturing. Eventually, we will have to face the fact that we were lying to ourselves when we believed the human yes could supersede the cosmic no. In Becker's words, man simply cannot justify his own heroism. He cannot fit himself into his own cosmic plan and make it believable. He must live with agonizing doubts if he remains in touch at all with the larger reality. On the other hand, to fully give up on ourselves is equally impossible. There is a persistent force within us, a will to live, a feeling that, somehow, the cosmic challenge to the value of our ambitions is not an absolute negation of their worth. In life, as we experience it, the cosmic no can never completely squelch the human yes. These two failed escapes corral us back into the middle, onto the battlefield, living in the tension between a species that says yes and a universe that says no, raising ourselves on this tiny planet within these vast surroundings, ambitiously pushing into an endless cosmos, which undermines the value of those ambitions. In this book, I will argue that the religious way of responding to this conflict, as an ideal type of response, is humanity's best way forward. All other responses, as Becker put it, somehow don't take life seriously enough. Niebuhr agreed, remarking that wise men usually resolve the paradoxes of religion and arrive at a simpler and more consistent truth, which has the misfortune of being untrue to the facts of human existence. The wise either ascribe a significance and dignity to man which denies his creatureliness and finiteness, or they think man insignificant because he is dwarfed by the vastness of the interstellar spaces. To put it simply, our attempts to resolve the human predicament usually lead to two ends. We imagine that we are ultimately significant or insignificant. We are either gods in the making, with the creative potential to loom over the universe, or we are insignificant specks of dust in a cosmic whirlwind. The paradox that we are both insignificant and ultimately significant simultaneously tends to escape the modern mind. So, we reduce this paradox to a simpler truth, and as we do, we close ourselves off to great dimensions of experience. The basic situation of a human being in the universe is both threatening and miraculous. But if we deny the threat, then we push away the miracle as well. Becker speaks to this point brilliantly, with another reflection on the moon landing. We set our teeth firm against the undermining power of the miraculous. Imagine it. Man has already landed on the moon and has yet to place a shrine or leave an offering there, but has already littered it with national flags. This speaks volumes about the kind of denials modern man uses to pursue and develop his special powers. In taking spaceflight, we exposed ourselves to a vision of how small and weak we actually are on the cosmic backdrop. And yet, when we landed on the moon, rather than make a gesture to the limited scope of our horizons, to the undermining power of the miraculous, the modern impulse was to plant our national flag there, to affirm our own creative powers, to affirm something as transient as our national identity in the face of something as permanent as the vastness of the cosmos, always looming over us, challenging us of our value. Even if most people seldom contemplate the vastness of the universe, that value challenge endures regardless. For human beings, as Becker saw, shrinking the scope of our awareness is not an option. Animals are not moved by what they cannot react to. They live in a tiny world. But look at man, the impossible creature. He lives not only in a tiny territory, nor even on an entire planet, but in a galaxy, in a universe. It is appalling, the burden that man bears, the experiential burden. Again, that burden remains salient in our world even when we deny it. In fact, our very denial of it is what shapes the character of our society. What is society, after all? In a word, Bella defines society as a locus for the confrontation with reality. To avoid that confrontation affects our limited day-to-day experience at the most basic level. In Becker's words, all the frantic and obsessive activity of daily life, in whatever country, under whatever ideology, is a defense against full self-consciousness. It is this fundamental falseness at the heart of human striving that makes our world dance so frenziedly to such drowning-out music. When one tries with all his heart and might to deny the obvious, he renders himself grotesque, and geniuses and sensitive people all through the ages have seen this grotesqueness of man and have shaken their heads in wonder at it. We are burdened with a vision of Earth on its cosmic backdrop, with a cosmic challenge to the value of our ambitions, whether we accept that burden into our lives or not. Our attempts to shrink away, to expel that vision from our daily lives and our normal interactions with each other, render us grotesque, and in the end, can only lead to disaster. Chapter 2: The Relative and the Absolute. While the previous chapter was about the challenge of our environment looming over us, this chapter is about the challenge of our environment moving through us. The basic premise of this chapter is that the interdependent structure of the cosmos, the interconnection of all things, presents a challenge to the value of our individuality, our personal sense of self. To this point, Becker wrote that man's body is a problem to him that has to be explained. The body is completely immersed in the whole of nature. There is no clear divide between the body and its environment. There is no body without food and water, without the atmosphere and the sun. The problem with our bodies is that they are not, in the final analysis, our own. In his commentary on the Diamond Sutra, Edward Conze wrote this note about the familiar Buddhist insight. The things which are composed of atomic dust are not real genuine units, and therefore each one of them is a non-collection. Since there is no clear divide between the body and its environment, the body is not a genuine unit, and the basic starting point of our self-understanding in the universe, that we are real genuine units, is in crisis. At the same time, our experience as genuine units is simply undeniable. Human experience has a genuine unitary quality. I alone perceive the universe from this vantage point. Here's how Niebuhr thought about this undeniable quality of our experience. As a creature who was involved in flux, but who is also conscious of the fact that he is so involved, he cannot be totally involved. A spirit who can set time, nature, the world, and being per se into juxtaposition to himself, and inquire after the meaning of these things, proves that in some sense he stands outside and beyond them. In other words, there is a quality of human experience that is, in some sense, outside and beyond the physical universe. We might say that consciousness itself, not the body, is the real genuine unit to which we belong. Our subjective point of view is itself unitary, whole, complete. But this singular quality of our awareness is transcendent. It is outside of time, nature, the world, and being per se. And so, once again, there is a tension between human beings and their environment, which Niebuhr defined in passing as the problem of the relative and the absolute. In this context, the problem is that the absolute conscious perspective of a human being is both separate from and embedded within the relative whole of nature. We are both immersed in our environment and separate from it at the same time. Becker summarized this tension neatly, referencing the psychologist Erich Fromm when he said that a human being is half animal and half symbolic. Because our subjectivity is itself beyond the physical universe, while we are inside of this universe, we have to understand and express ourselves symbolically. We are not just an animal body. We also have a symbolic self, a character and a world of meaning that acts as a representation of our transcendent awareness. The essential point, again, is that human beings experience their involvement in nature and their detachment from nature simultaneously. Niebuhr conveys this paradox in two decrees. First, we do not have the freedom to overcome our precarious dependence upon nature. But this law has a flip side, which Niebuhr also affirms. We do not have the freedom to destroy our freedom over natural process. In short, we can neither reduce ourselves nor escape from the whole of nature. There is a permanent tension between our dependence and our freedom, between the relative and the absolute sides of our existence. To this same point, Becker cites the biblical myth of the fall, the classic origin story of our essential nature. Man was once on a par with all the rest of nature, blissfully ignorant of his condition and his fate. But then he ate the apple of self-knowledge and felt shame. That is, he now had self-reflexivity and self-consciousness. He stuck out from all the other animals and could no longer enjoy their serene existence, their ignorance of death and of the burden of the miraculous. Soren Kierkegaard interpreted this basic insight for the people of his own time, and a century later, Becker and Niebuhr both agreed with this particular aspect of his analysis. The tension between the relative and the absolute sides of our existence is the wellspring of our anxiety. Here are Kierkegaard's words in 1844, with an annotation by Becker. If a man were a beast or an angel, he would not be able to be in dread. That is, if he were utterly unself-conscious or totally unanimal. Since he is a synthesis, he can be in dread. Man himself produces dread. And here is the same thought from Niebuhr. Man, being both free and bound, both limited and limitless, is anxious. Anxiety is the inevitable concomitant of the paradox of freedom and finiteness in which man is involved. A human being is a schism. We lack the easy conscience of a free, independent being that knows itself entirely, as well as the easy conscience of an instinctive animal who does not feel the self-reflecting tension between its own identity and the rest of nature. Are we genuine units, or aren't we? In what sense are we actually individuals? The entire cosmos is complicit in creating this anxiety, this tension between ourselves and our environment. The interdependent structure of the universe, the interconnection of all things, presents a challenge to the value of our individual identities. This is the essential point. The challenge is secure. We are insecure. Chapter 3. Life and Death. Out of the three challenges to human value presented in this book, it seems like death would require the least amount of explanation. Yet perhaps because it is the most apparent, our imagination is continually drawn to its potential eclipse. The basic premise of this chapter is that death, as a cosmic challenge to the value of our existence, is secure, inescapable through any amount of progress or possible ingenuity. If an immortal ever reads this book, I suppose he should feel free to discard its arguments. Although, exactly when does someone become an immortal anyway? Living 5 billion years is a very long life, but it is not immortality. More importantly, I think the value problem for such a being would only increase in proportion to how long it lived. The ultimate questions: what is the use of its ambition? What is the status of its individual identity? what is the point of its existence, would not go away no matter how long it lived. This is undoubtedly true because the structure of the cosmos itself participates in the formation of these questions. The very environment in which the immortal is immortal challenges the value of his ambitions, identity, and existence. Undaunted, the inventor Ray Kurzweil is the most prominent spokesperson of an event referred to as the singularity, a climactic moment when technological innovation will outpace our ability to understand or control it. In the future he envisions, people will merge with technology to outgrow all of the cosmic value challenges presented in this book. Kurzweil hopes to live 700 years and resurrect the dead, including his own father. He predicts that by the 2030s, most people will be able to achieve mental immortality by backing up their brains. In short, we will transcend all of the limitations of our biology. No longer threatened by our natural environment, our destiny is to prevail over the very context in which we live. Ultimately, the entire universe will become saturated with our intelligence. This is the destiny of the universe. Everyone knows that new technologies can change the world in surprising ways. But not everyone sees that at the height of our creative furies, we are drawn into fanatic optimism, into visions of a perfect society or a limitless freedom, as Miller saw in the flying mania of the 1930s. In general, as Niebuhr observed, modern man does not understand the hopes of an unconditioned perfection, both social and individual, which beckon the human conscience, and which are involved in every concept of the relative and the historical good. He sees them in history, but does not see that they point beyond history. The idea of an immense technological revolution to restructure the universe itself is as absurd as any religious faith has ever been. But the people caught up in this fury don't see that in Kurzweil's narrative, we are overcoming problems in life that cannot be overcome. They see Kurzweil's narrative in history, but do not see that it points beyond history, as much as any prophetic religion ever has. In the real world, there is no reason to believe that our creative powers, in themselves, by their own natural development, will engender a utopia. On this point, perhaps no one is better than Niebuhr. Here he conveys a principle of necessary tension between our creativity and destructiveness. History cannot move forward towards increasing cosmos without developing possibilities of chaos by the very potencies which have enhanced cosmos. The advent of the airplane was a sign of cosmos, the benefits of our new creative power over nature, faster movement of resources, and more cross-cultural interactions. Yet it also enhanced the possibilities of chaos, new forms of war, and the rapid spreading of disease. In Niebuhr's view, this tension is intrinsic to the very energies of our existence. The dynamic energies of human life, which destroy the harmonies of nature, are also the creative forces of history. That is a paradox which has not dawned upon the consciousness of any simple-minded modern. Instead of solving the basic problems of human existence, our increasing creative power simply reveals them on progressively new levels. Consequently, every new energy of life and every higher creative force can be and will be a force of disintegration as well as of integration. To sum it up, modern culture believes that history moves from chaos to cosmos by forces immanent within it, but history does not support this conclusion. After the chaos of World War I, Niebuhr's contemporary Karl Barth developed a new movement within Christianity, a neo-orthodoxy that re-emphasized the limitations of our existence, the ultimate weakness and destructive potential of our creative powers, a form of Christianity intended to undermine our false sense of security. In his book, The Epistle to the Romans, he wrote, "The more the unbroken man marches along his road secure of himself, the more surely does he make a fool of himself. The more certainly do that morality and that manner of life, which are built up upon a forgetting of the abyss, upon a forgetting of men's true home, turn out to be a lie. It is indeed not difficult to show that this is so." In the first 3 chapters of this book, I showed how the structure of the cosmos itself presents a challenge to human value in three basic ways: by the vastness of the cosmos, which challenges the value of what we do; by the interdependence of the cosmos, which challenges the value of who we are; and by the cosmic cycle of life and death, which raises the question of why we exist at all. In short, what I tried to do in part 1 of this book was to place the human species in its ultimate context, to define our basic situation as self-aware beings in the universe. Our environment looms over us, penetrates through us, and kills us. As Becker would argue, this situation is the hardest thing to fully accept. In fact, it is unacceptable. But its very unacceptability is what proves it to be true. It is the reason that we search for meaning. If we did not experience a challenge to our value from the very context in which we live, then we would not experience a desire to fulfill ourselves at all. And if our value problem was not ultimately inescapable, then our basic attempts to escape it would not be repeated over and over and over again. Part 2. Our 4 responses to the problem of human value. From a pragmatic point of view, there must be something false about a belief system that stops short of all of man's empirical reality, and that fails when a segment of that reality fails. At the most basic level of analysis, there are not so many ways to try to resolve the human predicament. The great variety of religions and philosophies that human beings have developed does not, as it might seem, represent an endless number of strategies for a solution. At a basic level, all of this water eventually flows through a few main channels. Each chapter in part 2 of this book describes one of these main channels, a primary mode of response to the problem of human value. As I showed in part 1, our value problem is rooted in a simple dialectic between ourselves and our environment, creature versus context. In Chapter 4, I'll explain our attempt to resolve this tension by elevating the creature over the context. In Chapter 5, I'll explain our attempt to resolve this tension by elevating the context over the creature. In Chapter 6, I'll explain our attempt to resolve this tension by accepting it, and in Chapter 7, I'll explain our attempt to resolve this tension by ignoring it. Chapter 4. Unilateral Affirmation. With the example of Kurzweil in Chapter 3, we already have an introduction to this attempt. To unilaterally affirm our value is to resolve the conflict between ourselves and our environment one-sidedly. It is to exalt ourselves above a cosmic structure that undermines us. In Niebuhr's view, this attempt should be entirely unsurprising, given the threatening larger reality of our lives. Man is a frail little insect buffeted by forces vaster than he. What is more natural than that he should seek to transmute his weakness into strength, that he should desire enough power to hold the enmity of nature at bay and to intimidate his human foes? So natural is this that we will concede its necessity and refrain from challenging it by pacifistic moralizing. It is easy to see how merely surviving the challenges of our environment might get transmuted in a self-aware creature into a final effort to overthrow the challenges of our environment. The philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche is instructive to this point. It is largely based on the principle that a living thing desires above all to vent its strength. Life as such is will to power. A human life, as it is meant to be lived according to Nietzsche, is an overthrowing of weaknesses, which culminates in the strong individual transcending himself to become a Superman. In the quest of the Superman, Nietzsche emphasizes the struggle against a Christian moral order that has made an ideal out of whatever contradicts the preservation instinct of a strong life. This is indicative of what Nietzsche labeled slave morality, which, out of fear and resentment, seeks to use ethical codes to control the strong. Those who live according to master morality, which does not hesitate to affirm the exercise of power. In the face of an overbearing Christendom, which is depressive and contagious, the task of the Superman is to constitute a revaluation of all values, a living declaration of war on and victory over all old concepts of true and untrue. The foremost quality of Nietzsche's Superman is a creative independence to remake the world of human meaning. His ideal is to be spiritually unbounded. His strength is to never be undermined by a deeper truth than his own. His quest, in the words of the scholar David Loy, is to deny one's groundlessness by becoming one's own ground. This is to be achieved through a spiritual war of liberation from the masses, from the weak, a war of meaning-making. Nietzsche is edifying because he represents another extreme form of the attempt to unilaterally win our confrontation with reality. Unlike Kurzweil, Nietzsche does not imagine that human beings will literally conquer the universe. Instead, victory will take the form of a spiritual liberation from everything that contradicts our strength and our vitality. In many ways, it will be an ideal illusion. And Nietzsche knew as much about his own philosophy, saying, "The further it is from actual reality, the purer, more beautiful, and better it becomes. Living in illusion is the ideal." The ideal is to forget about actual reality, the insurmountable cosmic challenge to the value of human life, and instead to drape ourselves in illusion, to fully enter that fantasy realm of self-assuredness, to act it out and make it real, to generate our own ultimate meaning. Of course, Nietzsche's vision for humanity is threatened by our inability to realize this state of pure illusion, to cut ourselves off from our own context so completely. Yet still, as he foresaw, the modern world is mightily striving toward that end. Again, in Nietzsche's view, human beings will find security in the will to power itself, by immersing ourselves completely in our own creative fury. Along this path, as Miller recognized in The Aviator's conquest of the air, the achievements of our creative furies will never actually satisfy our furious need to create. But as Nietzsche sees it, we'll be so caught up in the fury that it will cease to matter. Nietzsche saw beyond the veil of his own game. He saw how this game is never-ending. It will always be playable, since we will always be like children in a universe that will always overwhelm us. With the strength of his spiritual sight and insight, the distance, and as it were the space, around man continually expands. His world grows deeper. Ever new stars, ever new images and enigmas come into view. Perhaps everything on which the spirit's eye has exercised its profundity and acuteness has been really but an opportunity for its exercise, a game, something for children and the childish. Perhaps the most solemn concepts, which have occasioned the most strife and suffering, the concepts God and sin, will one day seem to us of no more importance than a child's toy, and a child's troubles seem to an old man. And perhaps old man will then have need of another toy and other troubles, still enough of a child, an eternal child. To summarize, whichever motive is dominant in a given situation, the motive to conquer nature, or to commit to the illusion that our creative fury is valuable in and of itself, the result is the same. We exalt ourselves above our own environment. For most people, these motives are entirely subconscious. We want to feel that our ambitions, identities, and existence might somehow stand out on the cosmic backdrop, and we arrive at these feelings together in ways that pass by largely unperceived. In other words, people generally do not see how their sense of their own value has been nourished by their culture. The social constructions that define the walls of our existence also define the parameters of our self-worth. And we have already been raised into this structure, so most of us don't see it. It is already pervasive, like the atmosphere itself. Society, as Becker saw it, is a codified hero system, which means that society everywhere is a living myth of the significance of human life, a defiant creation of meaning. Every society, thus, is a religion, whether it thinks so or not. In Becker's view, it is too psychologically burdensome for people to live, at all moments, with a sensation of the abyss, with an awareness of our true home. It undermines us too completely. So most of us develop a practiced self-deceit, what we call the mature character. The mature character is secure and self-assured, but only inside the defiant creation of meaning that is her society. To maintain her sense of security, the mature character never fully reflects on the ways that she is living inside a myth. She does not see the defiant creation in the ultimate sense. She only sees the obviousness of meaning in the immediate sense. She does not see the universe that says no. She only sees the society that says yes. In short, she unconsciously draws her sense of value from the mythological structure of her society. We earn this feeling of affirmation by carving out a place in nature, by building an edifice that reflects human value. A temple, a cathedral, a totem pole, a skyscraper, a family that spans 3 generations. The hope and the belief is that the things that man creates in society are of lasting worth and meaning, that they outlive or outshine death and decay, that man and his products count. But when we enter into a time of crisis, when our security vanishes, when the mystery underneath everything rises to the surface and undermines the world we thought we knew, it is both a terrifying and a wonderful revelation. The mature character is someone who constantly unconsciously avoids this revelation. Like every true artist, Miller struggled against the inertia toward maturity, our collective adaptation to obliviousness. The wonder and the mystery of life, which is throttled in us as we become responsible members of society. Becker agreed, writing that most of us, by the time we leave childhood, have repressed our vision of the primary miraculousness of creation. We have closed it off, changed it, and no longer perceive the world as it is to raw experience. This closed-off way of being is more than an ancillary spiritual concern to the future development of civilization. As I will argue in this book, it is, in fact, the root problem out of which all others emanate. We simply cannot sustain a civilization that resembles a daydream, a world-uniting game of self-deceit, a culture that avoids its confrontation with reality, a people that defend against an awareness of their true home. At some point, we have to wake up together into the terrifying wonder of it all. For Becker, Niebuhr, and Miller, one of the defining characteristics of modern life is the way that people exist, perhaps more than ever, entirely inside their society's defiant creation of meaning. We live inside the human yes to shield us from the cosmic no. It is easy to see how such a sheltered way of life is vulnerable to corruption. Why are groups so blind and stupid? Asked Becker. Because they demand illusions, answered Freud. They constantly give what is unreal precedence over what is real. And we know why. The real world is simply too terrible to admit. It tells man that he is a small, trembling animal who will decay and die. Illusion changes all this, makes man seem important, vital to the universe, immortal in some way. The masses look to the leaders to give them just the untruth that they need. For Miller, the near total separation that occurs in modern life between our day-to-day activities and the underlying reality can be so unbearable that a devastating tsunami rushing in, a reacquaintance with our true home, a re-exposure to the cosmic no, which is the truth that lies beyond the inwardly gazing city, often feels preferable to this disconnected, artificial, suffocating yes. I wanted a metamorphosis. I wanted the earth to open up, to swallow everything in one engulfing yawn. I wanted to see the city buried fathoms deep in the bosom of the sea. I wanted to sit in a cave and read by candlelight. I wanted something of the earth which was not of man's doing, something absolutely divorced from the human, of which I was surfeited. I wanted something purely terrestrial and absolutely divested of idea. I wanted to feel the blood running back into my veins, even at the cost of annihilation. To be englobed and encompassed, and to encompass and englobe at the same time. No more pity, no more tenderness, heartless as the earth itself. to be englobed and encompassed, and to encompass and englobe at the same time. That is a particularly brilliant exposition of our paradoxical nature, our situation as creatures, both within and beyond our own environment simultaneously. Miller's protest is that the first half of this paradox is dismissed by modern culture. When you dismiss being englobed and encompassed, you no longer have a paradox. All you have is the individual and its power to encompass and englobe. The essential point, again, is that on a shared subconscious level, modern society is a living myth that the human yes is strong enough to overcome the cosmic no. The theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer reflected on the depth of our commitment to this existential position in his Letters and Papers from Prison, a year before his execution by the Nazis. The world that has become conscious of itself and the laws that govern its own existence has grown self-confident in what seems to be an uncanny way. False developments and failures do not make the world doubt the necessity of the course that it is taking, or of its development. They are accepted with fortitude and detachment as part of the bargain, and even an event like the present war is no exception. This world has become conscious of itself and the laws that govern its own existence, and perhaps as a result, we have become a civilization devoid of any larger context, a civilization that denies its groundlessness by attempting to become its own ground. The superstructure is a lie, and the foundation is a huge quaking fear, writes Miller. The primary lie is the lie that justifies our narrow focus, namely, that our value is, or ought to be, secure in this world. The primary fear is the fear that drives our awareness even narrower, namely, the fear that we are lying to ourselves. In general, the creative fury of modern civilization is a practiced self-deceit, a distraction from the abyss. And the more derivative, superficial, and unfulfilling our creative fury becomes, the more intensely we chase after that receding sense of meaning. How are we to stop the blind rush? Asks Miller. How are we to stop the automatic process, each one pushing the other over the precipice? Far from making people doubt the necessity of this course that we are taking, the swarm becomes more rapid and more confident in what seems to be an uncanny way. Heads everywhere turn in unison. The story, the immediate drama. It grows closer to the skin and thicker in the air. It is as if the dome above the modern world was actually and permanently opaque. So intensely do we focus on our proximate powers in our immediate context. What we need now is a new form of what was lost, an ordering principle that is based on something deeper than the individual and its power, a way of understanding ourselves and living together that integrates the threatening larger reality into our lives. Chapter 5. Subordination. In the last chapter, I explained our attempt to overcome our own environment, either physically or psychologically, to exalt ourselves above the very context in which we live. In this chapter, I will explain the opposite strategy, the attempt to completely submit, to resubmerge ourselves in the whole of nature. Becker called these divergent strategies our twin ontological motives, and he summarized them as follows. On the one hand, the creature is impelled by a powerful desire to identify with the cosmic process, to merge himself with the rest of nature. On the other hand, he wants to be unique, to stand out as something different and apart. By rejecting the impulse to stand apart and dominate nature, billions of human beings across history have in one way or another sought to resolve their value problem by merging with it instead, by subordinating themselves to their environment. To understand this attempt, let's begin with this statement from the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna. The teaching of the Buddhas is wholly based on there being two truths, that of a personal everyday world and a higher truth which surpasses it. That higher truth, in Buddhist terms, is one of interdependence, impermanence, and emptiness. It is the truth of a unified and fluctuating nature that completely engulfs and penetrates the individual, dissolving the apparent sense in which a person is a genuine unit. Consequently, our personal everyday world, in which that apparent sense of ourselves is the governing feeling, is illusory and hopelessly dissatisfying. It therefore seems, as Niebuhr concluded, that this higher truth of Buddhism annuls the meaning of human history. This higher meaning cancels out all historical meanings, which were fragmentary. Bella put it even more simply. The Buddhist contention is that the world is a burning house, and man's urgent need is a way to escape from it. As we have already clearly seen, Becker agreed with Buddhism's diagnosis that our personal everyday world is illusory and dissatisfying. It is upheld by denial and characterized by corruption. But he also considered it to be necessary. It is a sanctuary of meaning in a dark, brutal cosmos. Man needs a second world, a world of humanly created meaning, a new reality that he can live, dramatize, and nourish himself in. At the very least, a Buddhist feels differently than Becker about the ways in which this second world is necessary, and at most, he completely disagrees that people need it. His ideal is to escape the human drama, to enter into a kind of naked perspective, to simply observe his personal everyday world from a position of non-attachment, to become awareness itself, and to watch his own life unfold as if it were one with the rest of nature. In order to make this escape, he clearly perceives the fact that his personal everyday world is utterly transitory. Let's compare the Buddhist ideal with the quest of Nietzsche's Superman. The Superman is a person who thrives in Becker's second world, becoming a master of it, eternally engaged in a symbolic war of meaning-making. The Buddhist ideal is to fundamentally give up on this war, a prospect which Nietzsche fulminates against. You want to live according to nature, he asks. Nature is indifferent beyond measure, without aims or intentions, without mercy or justice. How could you live according to such indifference? To live, is that not precisely wanting to be other than this nature? While Nietzsche considers the Buddhist ideal to be life-denying, from a Buddhist perspective, according to Loy, the problem is not our nothingness, but the ways we try to evade it. A Buddhist confronts his nothingness, or, in the terms of this book, the challenges to his value from the very context in which he lives, and through that process reaches a kind of negative affirmation, a state of nirvana. The difficulty is that this is not the kind of salvation we want, a grounding being for the ego self. This path toward resolution is problematic in another way as well. A Buddhist tries to release his own attachments to Becker's second world, to ease away from the constant war of meaning-making, and finally to observe it all from the perfect quietude of consciousness itself. In the words of the Diamond Sutra, let your mind come forth without fixing it anywhere. But as people often notice, there is something about this whole attempt that seems inherently paradoxical. As the scholar Jim Hansen asks, how can the extinction of desire result except through the exercise of desire to extinguish itself? How can a human ever liberate himself from his humanity when, as his own liberator, he is always all too human? Recall Niebuhr's caution on this point. Man cannot, by taking thought, reduce himself to the proportions of nature. He does not have the freedom to destroy his freedom over natural process, any more than he has the freedom to destroy his precarious dependence upon nature. This is the problem of nirvana, namely, that there are many things about the self that cannot be transcended. To stop evading our own nothingness, to perceive the illusory ego from the metaphorical space behind it, utterly empty yet aware, is still to be a person. Even in a state of nirvana, we remain divided creatures, in the world, yet out of it. The tension between ourselves and our environment, between our transcendent awareness and all the stuff of reality, still endures. In fact, through the practice of meditation, this tension is clarified and becomes more powerful. It is revealed, observed, and worked out on increasingly deeper levels. As Nietzsche would say, with the new strength of spiritual insight, our world grows deeper. New enigmas come into view, and we are given another toy. Still other troubles appear for the eternal child. Becker summarized it this way: as long as man is an ambiguous creature, he can never banish anxiety. What he can do instead is to use anxiety as an eternal spring for growth into new dimensions of thought and trust. In his last instructions before dying, the Buddha advised his disciples, "You must be your own lamps, be your own refuges, take refuge in nothing outside yourselves." Nietzsche wrote that every superior human being will instinctively aspire after a secret citadel where he is set free from the crowd, the many, the majority. As Miller tried to imagine what a vital religious pursuit might look like in the modern world, it seems as if both figures, in different ways, inspired his turn toward individualism. Like Nietzsche, Miller reveals the hazards of exalting ourselves above the very context in which we live. As Thomas Nesbitt writes in his book, Henry Miller and Religion, Miller assembles a religious world in which the self is God. His self-worship takes American religiosity to its extreme, pushing self-reliance to its irresponsible limits. Freedom is to be achieved at all costs, tearing social bonds between family and friends. At the same time, in his appropriation of Buddhist insights, Miller reveals the hazards of traveling too far in the opposite direction, of subordinating ourselves to our environment too much. If one manages to survive, to go on living above and beyond the sense of desperation and futility, one becomes unnaturally gay, unnaturally healthy, unnaturally indifferent. The tragic sense is gone. One lives on like a flower, a rock, a tree. If your best friend dies, you don't even bother to go to the funeral. If a man is run down by a streetcar right before your eyes, you keep on walking just as though nothing had happened. Life becomes a spectacle. Loneliness is abolished because all values, your own included, are destroyed. There is no fundamental, unalterable difference between things. All is flux, all is perishable. In its ideal form, the Buddhist path directs a person to walk the middle way, to honestly hold the tensions of their existence, and thereby to spring into new dimensions of awareness. But the same thing is true for an ideal form of Christianity, or Islam, or any other religious or philosophical doctrine. As I said at the beginning of this section, at a basic level, all of this water eventually flows through a few main channels. The principal danger for Buddhism is that it might veer too far in the direction of a downward solution, subordinating the creature to the context. The principal danger for Christianity, certainly in the modern era, is that it might veer too far in the opposite direction, an upward solution, elevating the creature over the context. The essential point is that both ways are eventually frustrated. Neither way goes far enough to escape the human predicament, to reach its ultimate end. The other important point is that, in reality, people do not normally yearn for either extreme. People do not want to be engulfed by nature, as little as they want to completely isolate from it. They want to be resolved as they are, in between. But this is the impossible desire. In Becker's words, man wants the impossible. He wants to lose his isolation and keep it at the same time. He can't stand the sense of separateness, and yet he can't allow the complete suffocating of his vitality. He wants to expand by merging with the powerful beyond that transcends him. Yet he wants, while merging with it, to remain individual and aloof, working out his own private and smaller-scale self-expansion. Niebuhr's basic critique of modern society is that we cannot even see this contradiction, and this characterizes what he calls the easy conscience of modern man. We have convinced ourselves that our impossible desire is easy to gratify. Here he summarizes the dialectic of our self-regard, using the term nature to stand for the subordination of our value, and reason to stand for its unilateral affirmation. Nature and reason are the two gods of modern man, and sometimes the two are one. In either case, man is essentially secure because he is not seriously estranged from the realm of harmony and order. Either it is nature which is itself that harmony, in which case mere ignorance has tempted man to stray from her innocency, and the return to it is easy. Or if, on the other hand, nature is regarded as a realm of chaos, the realm of reason is an easily accessible asylum from, and force of conquest over, the conflicts and disharmonies of nature. The modern man is, in short, so certain about his essential virtue because he is so mistaken about his stature. What Niebuhr describes is a kind of cultural schizophrenia in the modern world. We do not know which ontological motive to follow. Shall we resubmerge ourselves in nature, or stand apart and dominate it? The very fact that the strategies of redemption are in such complete contradiction to each other proves how far modern man is from solving the problem of his life. This chapter was about our attempt to subordinate the value of our personal, everyday world to the whole of nature. But in the very act of making this attempt, we conjure a paradox, which Niebuhr expressed in a sermon, using the term naturalism to stand for that general scientific opinion that at the deepest level, a human being is a body, a self-contained animal on a tiny planet, in a universe that is, at its deepest level, inert and totally indifferent to the human drama.
One of the most significant things about naturalism is that naturalism will come to the conclusion that man isn't very significant in the whole cosmic process, but there's a very curious paradox in the fact that a man can look at the cosmic process and at the human drama and declare that the human drama is not significant. What a curious position of eminence from which to make these judgments.
Becker discerned the same paradox. Human affairs are hardly worth considering in earnest, and yet we must be in earnest about them. A sad necessity constrains us. And the haiku master Kobayashi Isa illuminates the same trouble perfectly. This world of dew is only the world of dew, and yet, oh and yet. As Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, we might often look upon life as an unprofitable episode, disturbing the blessed calm of non-existence. But no matter how far this impulse goes, the and yet remains a part of our shared experience. It is our feeling that the cosmic challenge to our value, while in fact insurmountable, still does not, somehow, amount to an absolute negation of our worth. It is our sense that the ultimate meaning, as Niebuhr put it, does not annul historical meanings, but fulfills them. Chapter 6. Divine Resolution. In this chapter, I will explain our attempt to accept the basic conflict of our existence, the conflict between ourselves and the very context in which we live. Throughout history, this radical form of acceptance has produced a radical claim that the human condition is transmuted from anxiety to contentment, from ambiguity to clarity, from insecurity to ultimate security. Here is how Niebuhr's colleague, Paul Tillich, understood this ultimate form of acceptance, or faith. Faith in providence is faith altogether. It is the courage to say yes to one's own life and life in general, in spite of the driving forces of fate, in spite of the insecurities of daily existence, in spite of the catastrophes of existence and the breakdown of meaning. The radical claim of faith is that through full awareness of the insecurity that inspires it, the cosmic challenge to our value is turned into an affirmation that the breakdown of meaning and the ultimate meaningfulness of existence are paradoxically and mysteriously interrelated. Because faith is essentially paradoxical, its language is necessarily mythological. In Becker's words, it is a super-ideal, this admission of despair, because it requires courage and openness that are rare in man. It is an ideal that can only be formulated mythically because it encroaches on what man can never know, where the help for his despair is to come from, and how it is to come. In its ideal form, faith transcends the intellect, reaching into what we can never know. To reduce it to an object of the intellect, a religious formula, is to reduce the paradox, the unification of opposites, into nothing but an epic contradiction, a straightforward absurdity. As the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre writes, from the standpoint of a self-sufficient human reason, Christianity necessarily appears as paradoxical and irrational. Christian faith depends not on argument, but on choice. At its best, faith is self-aware of its own absurdity. Every other response to our value problem is also absurd, but faith negates the critique by owning up to it. Our twin ontological motives, to seek an upward solution, elevating the creature over the context, or a downward solution, subordinating the creature to the context, are both attempts to escape an inescapable fact, that the conflict between ourselves and our environment can never be finally resolved in one direction. The full reality of the human situation threatens to make these motives look absurd. At its best, faith accepts the full reality of the human situation and consciously acts by virtue of the absurd. Faith is this paradox, writes Kierkegaard, that the particular is higher than the universal. In the terms of this book, the individual, whose value is undermined by the very cosmos in which he lives, discovers a transcendent ground upon which his life is still affirmed, a ground that is deeper than the universe itself. Correspondingly, the yes of faith that Tillich speaks of is not our own creative capacity to refute the cosmic no. It is, in theological terms, God's creative capacity, a transcendent force of affirmation that is beyond the cosmic no, outside the negating forces of existence. Of course, in the modern world, this transcendent force of affirmation feels too transcendent. The mystery of divine resolution feels too mysterious. The gap between ourselves and God looks too enormous to be bridged, which led Tillich to ask, if the divine order and the historical order have nothing to do with each other, how can the divine order concern us at all? In his book, Original Sin and Everyday Protestants, Andrew Finstune quotes Niebuhr on the mysterious gap between ourselves and God, and how Christians were responding to this problem in his time. One such roadblock to faith was Christianity's requirement of a trust that the mystery of existence had meaning, a trust that God dwelled in this mystery. Without this sense of mystery, Niebuhr continued, the individual was very far from the Christian faith. Christians, however, could deny mystery just as much as, if not more, than non-Christians. In fact, denials of divine mystery often came from the mouths of the most religious of Christians. Whether in the pulpit or the pew, these were Christians who denied God by affirming God so absolutely, something Niebuhr characterized as the pretension of knowing more about God than anybody has a right to know, of being a pretender into the privacy of God. In short, the religious response to our value problem can fail in two basic ways. It can delude people into believing the transcendent force of affirmation is closer and more comprehensible than it actually is. Or it can dishearten people who feel like it is so distant and mysterious that it lacks real meaning. Or consider another way to think about it. When the religious response to our value problem fails, it fractures and reduces itself to the shortcomings of our twin ontological motives. Faith either becomes a cover for an upward solution, the attempt to exalt ourselves through a dogmatic religious formula above the very context in which we live, or its inefficacy makes it a reason, in itself, to seek a downward solution, the attempt to completely submit to the meaningless flux of nature. Throughout the age of science, theologians have often imagined that this new frontier of understanding would lead to a proof of God. In his book, Without God, Without Creed, The Origins of Unbelief in America, James Turner chronicles the story of religious leaders who, both threatened and seduced by the new triumphs of reason, incorporated rational arguments for God into their faith. Then, predictably, scientists came up with counter-arguments, new hypotheses other than God, to explain the workings of nature. Eventually, it became feasible to abandon God, to believe simply in man. In our own time, The failures of this movement, known as natural theology, have spawned a willful ignorance of science on the part of religious leaders to protect and simultaneously radicalize their communities. But it would be unfair to simply blame religious people for their failure to adapt to the modern intellect. After all, religious people are not only antagonized by the modern intellect, they are also antagonized by the modern sentiment, typified by people like Kurzweil. This world rushes ahead in disregard of the basic tensions of our existence, assuming that the entire human predicament is easily or soon to be resolved. And it is often the religious people, in all of their irrationality, who are correct about a fundamental point. This modern sentiment is crazy. Of course, religious people are modern as well. Many of them also seek, in the guise of religion, the one-sided affirmation of human value espoused by secular moderns. Religion today is not only bad in an obvious way, for contradicting the modern intellect. It is also bad in a subtle way, for latching on to the modern sentiment, for wanting God's transcendent affirmation to be a rational deduction, for seeing this affirmation as being manifested in wealth and social status. As a new kind of liberal Christianity emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries, more theologians began to feel that the realization of Christian values depended largely on the political system, that spiritual factors and economic factors were closely connected. While this new expression of Christianity, with a focus on social justice, represented progress in many ways, it also threatened to reduce religion to a form of politics, a threat that has now been fully delivered. The social and economic realities of modern life have come to feel so all-encompassing, partly because of our strong religious commitment to that same level of existence. We are dogmatically committed to the mythological structure of our society, to the economic and social drama of modern life. The typical modern person, in Becker's words, follows out his unconscious urges in the frantic activity of daily life. He fits himself into the bureaucratic industrial machines of our day and gives his uncritical allegiance to the nation-states that run these machines. He is part of an objectified structure, an ant doing his small part reflexively in a huge anthill of delegated power and authority. He follows orders, keeps his nose clean, and gets whatever satisfactions his character structure has equipped him to seek. Even in their apparent opposition to this type of existence, in their critiques of power structures, their protests, and their hashtags, modern people typically betray their real commitment to the frantic activity of daily life, to fitting themselves into this huge internet anthill, to whatever satisfactions their culture has equipped them to seek. Even in their struggle to stop it, they helplessly contribute to the quickening swarm. Even in their struggle to awaken, they woke into a deeper sleep. In the second half of the 20th century, a movement known as liberation theology emerged and spread across the Christian world. Its objective was to liberate the non-person, those who are not recognized as people by the existing social order, the poor, the exploited, those systematically and legally deprived of their status as human beings. In the context of this book, it should be clear why this laudable effort could have a dark side. It seeks to empower the individual in a world already destroying itself by empowering the individual, a world already exalting people above the very context in which they live. The impulse of liberation theology is correct in an obvious sense. Millions of people in this world are in desperate need of basic resources, in need of emancipation from oppressive social systems. But if we empower the oppressed among us without confronting our larger reality, which undermines everyone's power, if we are political without being religious, in a manner of speaking, if we amplify the human yes in a world already drowning out the booming cosmic no, it can only heighten our hysteria. In this situation, non-persons will at best be elevated to the status of false persons, following out their unconscious urges with the rest of us, with our capacity of devotion to larger ends shrunken and atrophied. as the theologian Walter Rauschenbusch said of the effects of modern capitalism. Vine Deloria, an early critic of the more short-sighted liberation theologies, made the essential point. We are freed and liberated only once we realize the insanity and fantasy of the present manner of interpreting our experiences in the world. To close this chapter, let's reconsider Tillich's question about the gap between ourselves and God. If this gap cannot be bridged, the religious response to our value problem will not have any meaning to us at all. The historical order and the divine order must relate to each other somehow. There must be a point of connection between our personal everyday world and God. There must be something inside the universe that points beyond it. To understand what this is, let's reconsider Tillich's definition of faith. It is the courage to say yes to one's own life and life in general, in spite of the catastrophes of existence and the breakdown of meaning. In other words, the transcendent force of affirmation is a courageous human yes in full awareness of the insurmountable cosmic no. It is a yes that comes from within us, yet it points beyond the universe itself. From this perspective, the gap between ourselves and God is nothing other than the gap between ourselves and our own courage, our own honesty, our own faith in the providence of life. To bridge this gap, the one thing needed, according to Tillich, is to be concerned ultimately, unconditionally, infinitely. From this perspective, the gap between ourselves and God is nothing but a chasm full of secondary, conditioned, and finite concerns. And here Tillich offers a second, related definition of faith. Faith is the state of being grasped by that which concerns us ultimately. The best way to invite this state upon us, according to Tillich, is to question the meaning of life in a way that is both serious and without a preconceived answer. The Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel put it this way: faith will come to him who passionately yearns for ultimate meaning, who is alive to the unbelievable core within the known, evident, concrete, who lives in the awareness of the ineffable, even though it may seem foolish, futile, and improper. He continued, to have faith does not mean to dwell in the shadow of old ideas conceived by prophets and sages, to live off an inherited estate of doctrines and dogmas. In the realm of spirit, only he who is a pioneer is able to be an heir. Authentic faith is more than an echo of a tradition. It is a creative situation, an event. To this same point, the philosopher Jose Ortega described how it is the spiritual explorers, those pioneers who are alive to the unknown, who feel in the deepest way that they are lost, how it is they who enter into that creative situation known as faith. They are the ones who naturally and powerfully have ultimate concern. This is the simple truth, that to live is to feel oneself lost. He who accepts it has already begun to find himself, to be on firm ground. Instinctively, as do the shipwrecked, he will look round for something to which to cling, and that glance, absolutely sincere, because it is a question of his salvation, will cause him to bring order into the chaos of his life. These are the only genuine ideas, the ideas of the shipwrecked. All the rest is rhetoric, posturing, farce. To bridge the chasm of our secondary, conditioned, and finite concerns, to leave behind the rhetoric, posturing, and farce, to live in the awareness of the ineffable, even though it may seem foolish, futile, and improper, is, at the same time, to lift the chaos of history into the order of the divine, to transmute the breakdown of meaning into the ultimate meaningfulness of existence, to connect our personal everyday world to God. It is to personify a religious ideal, to become what Tillich called the new being. Miller agreed, writing, "New beings, yes, we have need of new beings still. We can do without the telephone, without the automobile, without the high-class bombers, but we can't do without new beings. We cannot do without them. No struggle for justice will be successful if it happens in a blind rush. It won't be truth and justice if it is brought about by minds whose whole awareness is an automatic process. If it is brought about by souls who have fallen into a chasm full of secondary, conditioned, and finite concerns. If it is brought about by spirits who huddle around the bonfire of rhetoric, posturing, and farce. Chapter 7. Apathy. In the second half of the 20th century, the apathetic mode of response to our value problem, to simply ignore the basic tensions of our existence, fully emerged. Let's consider the apathetic person in relation to Nietzsche's Superman. The Superman conjures an illusion that his own creative power is valuable in and of itself, as if he lived outside the negating forces of existence. But the Superman knows and cares about those forces. He is aware of the cosmic challenge to his value, even as he refutes it. Rising to that challenge is what defines him as a Superman. The essential difference is that the apathetic person either doesn't know or doesn't care. From his perspective, a universe that speaks an irrefutable no to his ambitions, identity, and existence is beside the point. What, then, could be the point? I don't know. Who cares? Tillich buoyantly shared his feelings on this type of existence in an interview.
I tell you, in all my life, what I ever hated was not atheism or doubt or anything like this, not even cynicism, but indifference. Having a good time, and this is all what life means, is for me the worst sin against the spirit.
This postmodern sensibility has never completely shed the more modern tendency to invest hope in a unilateral affirmation of our value. In other words, deep down, the apathetic person is still pretending to be a Superman, still imagining, however vaguely, that he might escape the human predicament. This is invariably the case, since an apathetic attitude is difficult to actually maintain. The apathetic person tries to ignore the cosmic challenge to his value from his position within the cosmos. In other words, he pretends there is a piece of ground upon which he could live that the universe cannot say no to. But there is no such ground, apart from God, which of course does not compel him. To oversimplify the history of this attitude, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the breakdown in our collective sense of meaning was generally felt to be a serious problem. The more it became feasible to abandon God, to believe simply in man, the more people also feared that we were spinning in a meaningless abyss. Blaise Cendrars, a literary influence of Miller's, depicted this troubling notion through his monstrous character, Morhavagine. The sole principle of life is masochism, and masochism is a principle of death, for which reason existence is idiotic, imbecile, and vain, without ultimate purpose, and life is futile. Likewise, in the last analysis, scientific knowledge is negative. All that we can admit or affirm, the only synthesis, is the absurdity of being, of the universe, of life. However, in the second half of the 20th century, this breakdown in our collective sense of meaning was normalized. Concerns about the futility of life or the absurdity of being were generally felt to be superfluous concerns. What mattered most was enjoying, however dumbly, the world around us, sedating as an end unto itself. To oversimplify again, in Cendrars' modern era, we indulged in a sense of progress, a belief in our power to overcome the very context in which we live, because the cosmic no still mattered to us. But in our own postmodern era, we indulge in a sense of apathy, a belief in our power to ignore the very context in which we live, since we have so thoroughly stripped our civilization of its ultimate backdrop. We have so completely disconnected our day-to-day existence from the terrifying wonder of it all. This postmodern mode of response to our value problem will be, and is, eventually frustrated. It cannot go far enough to escape the human predicament, to reach its ultimate end, the perfect lack of concern. An apathetic worldview is only possible for a while, before tragedy interrupts it. before we learn that suffering can penetrate all of our defenses, that suffering gets to the core, and because it does, destroys the impervious center from which we pretended to be apathetic. This was the insight of Tillich and others during World War II. How much of our lives consists in nothing but attempts to look away from the end? We often succeed in forgetting the end, but ultimately we fail, for we always carry the end with us in our bodies and souls. And often whole nations and cultures succeed in forgetting the end, but ultimately they fail too, for in their lives and growth, they always carry the end with them. When the end comes, our apathy comes to an end as well, and then we encounter a stark choice. If the foundations of this place and all places begin to crumble, cynicism itself crumbles with them, and only two alternatives remain: despair, which is the certainty of eternal destruction, or faith, which is the certainty of eternal salvation. In the terms of this book, when our attempts to unilaterally affirm our value backfire, and our apathetic worldview can no longer be sustained, we are left with two basic ways to understand our life and history. Either it is a lost cause that demands the subordination of our value to the whole of nature, or it is redeemed through a divine mystery, despite all evidence to the contrary. As the Christian moral order started to lose its relevance in the Western world, and a global civilization started to emerge, it became possible for people like Nietzsche to declare, "There are no moral phenomena at all, only a moral interpretation of phenomena." Nietzsche's Superman is the person whose interpretation ultimately wins out. Morality is whatever the Superman says it is, and this is the initial condition for the apathetic outlook on morality, a unilateral affirmation of morals. Each group, subgroup, or person affirming their own moral order for themselves, on their own terms, in disregard of any common, larger context. This collection of individual moral orders makes up a relative whole, a world without an absolute ground on which to compare its moral truth claims. It is only natural that such a world became a hotbed for indifference. It is easy to be cynical when you are born into a world of wannabe supermen. In our own time, a global civilization has fully emerged where apathy remains a valid lifestyle, where we can still maintain indifference as an appropriate way of being, where the belief in our power to ignore the very context in which we live is still ascendant. A civilization devoid of any larger context is a civilization without access to an objective point of view. Its people have lost the power to congregate in a shared awareness. Metaphorically speaking, that empty point of view, that realm of shared awareness, is shrinking every day. Modern society is like a melting iceberg on which people vie to win their piece of psychic territory, to secure their sense of meaning in this increasingly meaningless world. As awareness itself dissipates, we live more and more in fragments, as thoughts, as feelings, as identities. In a civilization devoid of context, we lack the ability to set these things aside, to stand apart from them and reflect on them together from a higher point of view. As a result, our politics becomes more tribal, less trusting, and ultimately more absurd, as people load the entire weight of their existence onto smaller and smaller patches of psychic ground. At the highest level of public discourse, where billions of people communicate with each other, the only thing left are fragments. Fragments unable to congregate in a shared awareness. Fragments without a common space to think and be together. Of course, this is also the time of the internet, where anything can be taken out of context and shared with the whole world instantly. The internet is a context-destroying machine, but that destruction also hints at a new creation, a world that is re-exposed to its ultimate context, the larger, abiding reality beyond every particular circumstance, a global civilization that unites in a shared awareness of our common situation as self-aware beings in the universe. But as things are at the moment, to adapt to the world around you, to immerse yourself in this culture, to join in the songs we sing to help us forget, is to lose a vital connection to yourself, to your own transcendent awareness, which is, at the same time, to lose a vital connection to other people, everyone nervously singing the song of modern life, expressing only a fragment of our souls, and earning our sense of value in that trifling remembrance of ourselves. On the other hand, to stand still, stop singing, and listen is to sense that greater loss of connection in which we share. To fall out of this chorus is like a death, which also bestows a clarity of perception, like a death that also hints at a resurrection, and anyone who would risk their life to venture into that underlying stillness will become like a ghost who searches for a way to be real, a way to manifest the fullness of your soul. As Miller discovered, you are apt to find such a person acting very much like a primitive being. Such a man is bent on doing one thing only, and that is to break the evil spell which has been put upon him. Such a man is beyond throwing bombs, beyond revolt. He wants to stop reacting, whether inertly or ferociously. This man, of all men on earth, wants the act to be a manifestation of life. If, in the realization of this terrible need, he begins to act regressively, to become unsocial, to stammer and stutter, to prove so utterly unadapted as to be incapable of earning a living, know that this man has found his way back to the womb and source of life, and that tomorrow, instead of the contemptible object of ridicule which you have made of him, he will stand forth as a man in his own right, and all the powers of the world will be of no avail against him. Heschel agreed, affirming the same reckless desire. There is an urge in wistful souls to starve rather than be fed on sham and distortion. In this world, it is the only way to cleanse your spirit, to clear your head, to find your way to solid ground, to discover a genuine wellspring of moral truth. In a world that has ridded itself of its own context, we are easily lost and confused. Here is Bella on the philosophical situation that we inherited, the atmosphere of ideas in which we live. Not only has any obligation of doctrinal orthodoxy been abandoned by the leading edge of modern culture, but every fixed position has become open to question in the process of making sense out of man and his situation. As a result, the search for adequate standards of action, which is, at the same time, a search for personal maturity and social relevance, is in itself the heart of the modern quest for salvation. For most people, this quest is still marked by a feeling that the basic tenets of moral truth are obvious and universal. This feeling certainly has something to do with the historical era and the culture in which we live, and the postmodern person would argue that this is all it has to do with. But it is hard to shake the sense that the obviousness of moral truth extends beyond our particular situation and is, in fact, generally applicable to life across the universe. Part 3. The Paradox of Morals. History presents a problem which points beyond history. Chapter 8. The Crux of the Problem. How could the basic tenets of common sense morality, such as love is preferable to hate, not be accepted as universal moral truths? The crux of the problem is to show that morality has something to do with the universe itself and is not simply a manifestation of our own partial interests. If the moral order is not rooted beyond our own assertions of it, then it is not a truth about the universe at all. It is just another one of our defiant creations of meaning. This philosophical problem has endured because, as William James put it, betterness is not a physical relation. How could the moral order be a fundamental aspect of the cosmos if physical relations, in themselves, are completely amoral? In Schopenhauer's view, this problem could hardly be more significant. In moral science, the need of a metaphysical basis is more urgent than in any other. For if life, it is averred, have a meaning, then the supreme goal to which it points is undoubtedly ethical. Without a metaphysical basis for morality, there is no fundamental connection between life and its ultimate backdrop. The struggle of good against evil is merely a game that we play on Earth, a game that we made up, and the architecture of reality makes no distinction between massacres and acts of loving kindness. In his attempt to resolve this problem, Immanuel Kant began his groundwork of the metaphysic of morals by stating, "It is impossible to conceive anything at all in the world, or even out of it, which can be taken as good without qualification, except a good will." That is a clever starting point. Human beings possess one thing that is undeniably good: our good will, our desire to do good. Of course, at some point, we have to act on our good intentions. We have to pursue and manifest a truly good ideal. And that is the crux of the problem. Without a truly good ideal, what is good is completely determined by the power of the will. The good is solely defined by what the will wants it to be. Kant has already hinted at the location of this truly good ideal. He has already said that nothing in the world will do. Morals, Kant assumes, following David Hume and aligned with the insight of James, must be independent of how the world goes, for how the world goes is non-moral. Kant therefore turns to reason by itself, which determines the will by a priori grounds. Reason, in this context, is pure logic, disconnected from any observations or interpretations of nature. Kant, in his own words, creates a completely isolated metaphysic of morals, mixed with no anthropology, no theology, and no physics. And yet, by taking his supreme principle of morality out of the physical universe, Kant's moral order shares a common problem with theistic moral orders. The transcendent is too transcendent. How can Kant propose that morality, something so involved in life, is rooted in a reason that is so completely removed from it? Schopenhauer felt the same way, criticizing Kant on this point. Pure, abstract conceptions a priori, without real contents, and without any kind of empirical basis, can never move people. The structure floats in the air, like a web of the subtlest conceptions devoid of all contents. It is based on nothing, and can therefore support nothing, and move nothing. In Kant's view, the transcendent moral order, reason itself, simply draws the will of a rational person towards it. But notice how, in this conceptual framework, the gap between our will and our reason is located entirely within us. The gap that must be bridged between the transcendent moral order and ourselves is entirely internal, in our own mind. Therefore, in the final analysis, according to Kant, the rational being utters the commands of morality to himself. He obeys no one but himself. When it comes to the basic conflict of our existence, the conflict between creatures and their context, Kant entirely sides with the autonomous individual. The will of every rational being is a will which makes universal law. This extreme emphasis on the individual and its power is itself the cause of moral relativism in our world. So it is clear that Kant's philosophy cannot lead us out of our moral crisis. Now let's review a current attempt to resolve this crisis. Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape: How Science Can Determine Human Values, as its subtitle implies, is an effort to use the powers of science to vanquish moral relativism. Harris explains how the purview of science is expanding into new knowledge about how and why we suffer, and conversely, new knowledge about how and in what environments we tend to prosper. If we simply account for this knowledge, then it becomes obvious that science has much to say about the moral order of the universe. What stops us from seeing this? Harris argues that we fail to see mostly because of our lack of scientific integrity and our undue respect for religious bullshit. His perspective is well summarized by the following rhetorical questions he asks. What would our world be like if we ceased to worry about right and wrong, or good and evil, and simply acted so as to maximize well-being, our own and that of others? Would we lose anything important? Harris's legitimate concern is that right versus wrong is a standard that is too elastic to have meaning in a world where people ceaselessly retort, according to whom? The bane of moral relativism will endure as long as people find grounds for the petulant follow-up. What if some people prefer torture and murder to spreading joy? Given the absurd prospect of such relativism actually holding sway in our world, Harris simply allows what is intuitively obvious about morality to stand as a self-sufficient truth. It is enough that the moral ideal is obvious. It makes no sense at all to ask whether maximizing well-being is good. Harris is right, of course, that in order to make any sense of our world, maximized well-being must reside at the positive end of the moral spectrum. It is obviously true. But it would also be obvious to many other great philosophers who have thought about this problem over the course of several centuries that something important is, in fact, lost in Harris's argument. To see what this is, let's just accept the obvious, that the moral ideal is maximized well-being. And now let's consider that principle in the context of the physical universe. As I argued in part 1 of this book, the structure of the cosmos itself presents a challenge to the value of our ambitions, identities, and existence. Our environment looms over us, penetrates through us, and kills us. Harris's supreme principle of morality, maximized well-being, is therefore undermined by the very environment within which he elevates the principle, making the principle look both absurd and decidedly unscientific. The person who simply acts so as to maximize well-being, without asking where that principle of action finally comes from, has stopped trying to understand the human condition on its ultimate backdrop. Harris appears to think that nothing is lost by immediately averting the philosophical problem he purports to resolve. But again, what is lost are the basic tensions of our existence, tensions between a species that says yes and a universe that says no. To be indifferent to the fact that we assert our moral ideal athwart the very context in which we live, to simply skip to the conclusion that maximized well-being is obviously the goal, is to resolve the basic tensions of our existence by ignoring them. In this way, Harris's efforts recall Becker's observation that they somehow don't take life seriously enough. His account of moral truth is ultimately more evidence of the world that we inhabit, a world that is rapidly losing touch with its basic need to understand itself against its ultimate backdrop, a world that has unburdened itself of any perspective higher than the pale blue skies hanging low over the individual's head, a global civilization devoid of context. Our world has lost the cultural resources to solve the problem of moral relativism. Our two favorite ways to respond to the human predicament, unilaterally and apathetically, are what cause and characterize the problem to begin with. As I said at the beginning of this chapter, the first thing needed to solve this problem is to show that the moral order is rooted beyond our own assertions of it. Otherwise, it is not a truth about the universe at all. It is just another story, just another one of our defiant creations of meaning. The second thing that is needed is summarized well by Schopenhauer. The true incentive to justice and loving kindness must be something that requires but little reflection and still less abstraction and complicated synthesis, something that, independent of the training of the understanding, speaks to everyone, even to the rudest, a something resting simply on intuitive perception and forcing its way home as a direct emanation from the reality of things. So, the moral order of the universe must be rooted beyond our own assertions of it, and it must be intuitively obvious. It must force its way home to us as a direct emanation of our reality. In the next chapter, I will circle back to part 1 of this book to show how the foundation of this moral order was already established, how being challenged of our value, as in worth, is directly linked to our system of values, as in ethics. The cosmic no is the anchor that secures the moral yes. Chapter 9. The Moral Order. To think about the moral order of the universe is to wonder, is there any fundamental force that guides the character of our action? Does the cosmos have an inherent moral compass? James thought that the universe was a purely indifferent structure, in itself completely unrelated to the moral impulses of human beings. He wrote that physical facts simply are or are not, and neither when present or absent can they be supposed to make demands. But in part 1 of this book, I showed how the universe presents its creatures with inescapable challenges to their value, and a value challenge is not indifferent. A value challenge is not neutral silence. It is a final, unspoken no. If the cosmic no was not actually final, if it was inconclusive or escapable somehow, then James would be right. If we could wiggle our way out of our own negation, then the universe would truly be an indifferent structure. But we cannot, so it is not. The goal of this chapter is to show how a universe that conclusively negates us is, through that very negation, a universe that defines our moral ideal and guides us toward it. To put it simply, the cosmic no is also our moral compass. Here's how Barth described this paradox. What dissolves the whole wisdom of the world also establishes it. Precisely because the no of God is all-embracing, it is also his yes. In the terms of this book, precisely because the cosmic no is all-embracing, it is also transformed into a decisive moral yes for self-aware beings in the universe. In part 1 of this book, I showed how the cosmic no might be understood to confront us in 3 ways. Vastness challenges the value of our ambition. Interdependence challenges the value of our individuality, and death challenges the value of our existence. Altogether, as individual actors inside the universe, we are decisively negated. It is obviously true. The hidden paradox is that it is precisely this negation that transforms our sense of self and directs us toward the state of maximized well-being. People who have realized this fully tend to speak about the principle of losing yourself in order to find yourself. When you surrender to the all-embracing no, who is it that remains? Clear and effortlessly present, the shock of the obvious is an all-embracing yes within you. To put it another way, when a person fully accepts the cosmic no, it is, in a manner of speaking, integrated into the life force. By the very act of accepting it, the no is transformed into a yes through human beings. In this way, our value challenges are transmuted into moral ideals. To oversimplify, the challenge to our ambition idealizes humility. The challenge to our individuality idealizes compassion. And the challenge to our existence idealizes, in Tillich's words, the courage to be. The cosmic challenge to our value, precisely because it is the undeniable truth of our situation, is also the fundamental force that guides the character of our action. The cosmic no, which decisively negates us, is also the force that determines who we will be once we accept it. This is the paradox of morals. Precisely because an all-embracing no engulfs our life, an all-embracing yes emerges through us. The paleontologist theologian Pierre Teilhard de Chardin reflected on this revelation in his own way. I doubt whether there is a more decisive moment for a thinking being than when the scales fall from his eyes and he discovers that he is not an isolated unit lost in the cosmic solitudes, and realizes that a universal will to live converges and is harmonized in him. The moral order of the universe is rooted beyond our own assertions of it. Human beings do not invent the moral order arbitrarily, out of nothing. We are born into an everlasting tension, as a creature that says yes, in a universe that says no. Within this tension is a pre-existing moral possibility, a latent ideal that we can either seek to actualize or not. For those who do, the moral life is a point of unification between creatures and their context, a union of yes and no, a convergence point for the tensions in reality itself. Far from being mutually exclusive, in the moral life, as Teilhard saw, the universal and the personal grow in the same direction and culminate simultaneously in each other. Niebuhr came to the same conclusion in his own words.
Both the prophets of Israel and the Stoics, or the classical philosophers generally, were right in saying morality is conformity to the essential structure of human existence. The laws of human existence are given in our very being. And morality means realizing these potentialities, conforming to this essential structure.
One of the problems that Kant was especially concerned with is how the moral order could be truly universal. In other words, how it could apply to all self-aware beings in the universe, not only to humans. As Schopenhauer tells it, this view of morals as existing not for men as men, but for all rational beings as such, is with Kant a principle so firmly established, an idea so favorite, that he is never tired of repeating it at every opportunity. The paradox of morals has deeper roots than culture. It comes from something deeper than the society in which we live. However, it is not so deep that it is altogether separate from the cosmos. It is not, as Schopenhauer wrote in Critique of Kant, a hair-splitting sophism or an a priori soap bubble. Instead, the moral order emanates from the basic situation of all self-aware beings in the universe, creatures who say yes in a universe that says no. Consequently, the moral order is intuitively obvious. All self-aware beings in the universe will discover the same moral order, as surely as they will discover the same challenges to their value, the same challenges to their ambition, individuality, and existence, the same cosmic no, which is directed at everyone equally, since it comes from the very context in which we live, from the structure of the universe itself. Of course, people have every right to balk at the cosmic no, but they will always be desperately contesting the truth of our shared situation. Our environment looms over us, penetrates through us, and kills us. The moral order of the universe means that a world that tries to override, deny, and ignore this basic truth will corrupt the moral ideal as much as it seeks to fulfill it. In our efforts to conquer nature, we unleash its worst furies. In our efforts to promote peace, we build ever deadlier weapons. In our efforts to produce abundant resources, we leave millions of people starving. In our efforts to increase mobility, we forget about where we are. In our efforts to enhance life, we create a world that is numb to it. The moral order of the universe means that to avoid our confrontation with reality, to shrink away from the terrifying wonder of it all, to drive ourselves into a blind obliviousness with social games, psychological tricks, and personal preoccupations, as Becker put it, is simultaneously a moral failure. Tillich described the same dynamic in terms of neurosis.
Neurosis is the escape from facing reality as a whole. People are too weak to face reality as it really is. And so they withdraw, and they have their safety in a limited relationship to life. And now the neurotic action follows. They defend this limited place on which they are able to live against the whole of reality.
In short, the paradox of morals indicates a link between self-contrived security and moral transgression. When we cling to little shelters from the all-embracing no, our yes becomes the scaffolds of our sheltered state of being. In other words, our effort to be well becomes our effort to deny our own negation, and our sense of being well becomes our sense that our denial was successful. In its general form, this manifests itself in our obsessions with beauty, wealth, or status, our beliefs in religious dogma, or human ingenuity to transcend the negation of our being. In its extreme form, this manifests itself in a pathological evasion of reality, a compulsive avoidance of vulnerability, the habitual covering up of our own lack. As the neurosis deepens, we repeat our anxious affirmations in every situation that we encounter. Whatever the question may be, the answer is always the same. Our yes becomes a power and an end unto itself, like a card you play that always wins, but the winning increasingly happens in a world of illusions, a completely symbolic world that shelters us from the intrusions of reality, from the upsetting difference between truth and falsehood, a realm which must be defended against outsiders who would arbitrate that difference. As the neurosis deepens further, It conjures up dualities that are more and more shockingly obvious. Its strength so clearly weakness, its freedom so clearly herd-like, its insight spreading falsehoods, its empathy spreading fear, its humility histrionic, its loyalty exploitation, its higher calling so evidently debased. So many people, as Becker saw, are sucked into the gravity of this madness. Agreed madness, shared madness, disguised and dignified madness, but madness all the same. And yet, from an outsider's perspective, the madness of these dualisms amazes like a kind of revelation, like an inside-out convergence point for the tensions in reality, a point of false separation between creatures and their context, an inverted disclosure of the union of yes and no. In place of the cosmic no is the yes of our neurotic kingdom, our pathological shelter, and in place of the human yes is the cosmic no incarnate, a wasteland in place of a spirit, a person who is all persona, a human being who is all facade in a community that is all a cover-up, a transcendent awareness reduced to fragments, each one beguiling the other with the spell of their absolute immanence, each one judging the other, a sign of avoiding the ultimate judgment, the universal challenge to our value. If we deny the negating forces of existence, if we choose not to assimilate them into our character structure, in short, if we do not brave that little apocalypse within ourselves, then we will push that confrontation out into society, and at some point, a big apocalypse will force us to embrace what we've avoided, unleashing like a storm upon us all. One way or another, human beings must enter into the crucible. It is impossible to shrink away. We are born into an everlasting tension as a creature that says yes in a universe that says no. One way or another, that tension will fully manifest itself in human history and stretch the human spirit to its limit. One way or another, humanity, and creation itself along with it, must be transformed. To conclude this chapter and state the obvious, a comprehensible moral order does not untangle the dilemmas of moral action in the world. An orienting principle does not resolve the problems of instituting and acting upon that principle. As Tillich put it, the truth of ethical relativism lies in the moral law's inability to give commandments which are unambiguous. Every moral law is abstract in relation to the unique and totally concrete situation. Nevertheless, there is a moral order in this universe, by which I mean that the structure of reality itself participates in characterizing our moral possibilities, that the basic situation of all self-aware beings in the universe comes with a moral compass, that the true good on our moral compass is universal and secure. Aligned with the insight of Barth cited earlier in this chapter, Tillich wrote that we live in two orders, one of which is the reversal of the other. He wrote that the negative character of the historical order is the positive character of the divine order. And he wrote that the two orders, the historical and the eternal, although they can never become the same, are within each other. The historical order is not separated from the eternal order. Translated into the terms of this book, the historical order is the cosmic no, while the divine eternal order is the human yes. But why is the human yes eternal and divine? Chapter 10. The Moral Pursuit as Religious Pursuit. In the previous chapter, I said that death, as a cosmic challenge to human value, idealizes the courage to be. By the very act of accepting it, the no of death is transformed into a yes through human beings. But what is the principle that enables our acceptance? What ground do we stand on when we say yes to life, in spite of the catastrophes of existence and the breakdown of meaning, in spite of the driving forces of fate, which obliterate any ground in the entire universe to stand on? With this question in mind, Niebuhr concluded, man is thus in the position of being unable to comprehend himself in his full stature without a principle of comprehension which is beyond his comprehension. To understand ourselves in our full stature against our ultimate backdrop is to understand that we are negated by the very cosmos in which we live, and therefore, in the final analysis, our will to live is a force that is beyond our understanding, a yes that contradicts the uncontradictable cosmic no, a yes that comes from within us, yet points beyond the universe itself, a transcendent force of affirmation. To put it another way, consciousness itself, that absolute core of ourselves that still says yes to life, in spite of the cosmic no, is itself eternal and divine. The principle that enables us to accept the unacceptable is that subjectivity itself, that witness to our life, is the witness to all life. That heart of our reality is the heart of all reality. It is therefore both closer to us and farther away than we can imagine. It resides at the center of ourselves and at the edge of the entire cosmos. In the same way, it is both for us and against us more profoundly than we can stomach. Tillich continues this train of thought with an exegesis of Psalm 139, summarizing much of this book in the process. The psalmist has found that the final solution lies in the fact that the presence of the witness, the presence of the center of all life, within the center of his life, implies both a radical attack on his existence and the ultimate meaning of his existence. We are known in a depth of darkness through which we ourselves do not even dare to look, and at the same time we are seen in a height of a fullness which surpasses our highest vision. That infinite tension is the atmosphere in which religion lives. A human being can be ultimately judged by whether or not he has reached and can stand that tension. To endure it is more horrible and more difficult than anything else in the world, and yet to endure it is the only way by which we can attain to the ultimate meaning, joy, and freedom in our lives. Each of us is called to endure. May each of us have the strength and the courage to bear that vocation, for it is to that vocation that we are called as men. As Heschel would say, the vocation to which we are called is endless wonder, and endless wonder is endless tension. Or, in Becker's words, which I quoted earlier, our vocation is to use anxiety as an eternal spring for growth into new dimensions of thought and trust. It is the only real choice a person has, to evade the infinite tension in which we live, to imagine that we can reduce it to a superfluous concern, or to resolve it in one direction or the other, cannot help but be a malady. Therefore, the religious position, as Becker put it, is that to strive for anything less than the ideal is illness. The ideal is to accept the infinite tension of our existence, to allow it to live within us without resolving it prematurely, to bear our experiential burden, and thereby to enter a dimension of infinite trust. As I showed in the previous chapter, the moral order is intrinsic to the basic structure of our existence, which led Tillich to conclude that morality is the free realization of a person as a person, and not the subjection to strange laws. But to realize ourselves freely, in this context, is a task, not an orgy. We cannot realize the moral ideal if we evade the challenge to our value that establishes that ideal in the first place. Therefore, a genuine moral life, a life that is realized freely, is upsetting to our false sense of security and undue self-concern. As Niebuhr observed, the great difficulty is that the struggle for ethical integrity is so painful that most men are tempted to seek some shortcut to it, and organized religion generally expresses the hopes and desires of this easygoing multitude. The theologian Rudolf Bultmann agreed, using the phrase authentic life to explain what makes the struggle for ethical integrity so painful. The authentic life would be a life based on unseen, intangible realities. Such a life means the abandonment of all self-contrived security. It means giving up every attempt to carve out a niche in life for ourselves, surrendering all our self-confidence, and resolving to trust in God alone. The link between self-contrived security and moral transgression, which I established in this book in my own way, for my own time, might once have been written as a long discussion of sin, which Bultmann defined as self-assertion, self-glorying. It deludes man into thinking that his existence is a prize within his own grasp. But in the modern world, religion, as that collective remembrance of our basic situation and that living expression of our ultimate ideal, as that vehicle in which we navigate together the antinomies of our existence, is clearly malfunctioning. It is no good telling a modern person he is a sinner, Bultmann concluded. He will only dismiss it as mythology. Instead of a symbolic language through which we can remember and express who we are, religion today often functions as a grotesque meta-symbol for how far we have drifted from our true center, an increasingly obvious sign of something essential that has been corrupted or forgotten. And yet, despite it all, the primary impetus towards religion is sincere. The religious pursuit is a genuine outgrowth of the human condition, an inevitable mode of response to the basic tensions of our existence. As Becker put it, the idea of God has never been a simple reflex of superstitious and selfish fear, as cynics and realists have claimed. Instead, it is an outgrowth of genuine life-longing, a reaching out for a plenitude of meaning. As I showed in part 2 of this book, this urge to be whole, to reach out for a plenitude of meaning, is corrupted by the belief that our ingenuity is strong enough to secure our own value, or that we can find security in a peaceful return to nature, or that God secures us in facile, eccentric ways, or that we are simply ends unto ourselves. Whichever of these beliefs is dominant in a given situation, they all eventually reveal what Becker saw, that much of the evil in our world is the result of our inherited, unconscious ways of seeking value. A large part of the evil that man unleashes on himself and his world stems not from a wickedness in his heart, but from the way he was conditioned to see the world and to seek satisfaction in it. Increasingly, we are conditioned to see this world as if it were an orb unto itself. These towers aren't rooted in any kind of ultimate ground. It's all a haywire construction gig taking place on a removed plane, an earthen floor detached from the rest of existence. The street and sky, the laws, norms, loves, hates, and even dreams of all these people shift in the synthetic light of civilization. There's no footing, no compass, no orientation toward the unconditioned. A vital religious pursuit, as Miller saw it, was the only way out of here. The wonder and the mystery of life, which is throttled in us as we become responsible members of society. Until we were pushed out to work, the world was very small, and we were living on the fringe of it, on the frontier, as it were, of the unknown. A small world which was nevertheless deep enough to provide all manner of variation, all manner of adventure and speculation. Not so very small either, since it held in reserve the most boundless potentialities. I have gained nothing by the enlargement of my world. On the contrary, I have lost. I have adapted myself to a world which was never mine. I want to break through this enlarged world and stand again on the frontier of an unknown world which will throw this pale, unilateral world into shadow. I want to stand once again before an impassable deep, which not even the strongest wings will enable me to traverse. We cannot sustain a world, a society, or even a personal psyche that evades the impassable deep, that does not seek to stand before it once again. We cannot sustain a civilization full of people lost in a dream about their ambitions, identities, and existence on this planet, who all together, in their diverse and divergent ways, spend their day-to-day existence rushing over the miracle of this moment, ignoring the very context in which they live, sedating their sense for the sacred. As Heschel observed, we are today beginning to comprehend that the sense for the sacred is as vital to us as the light of the sun. The true foundation upon which our cities stand is a handful of spiritual ideas. Correspondingly, in our last word from Niebuhr, he summarizes the connection between our moral and religious pursuits. Civilization may be beyond moral redemption, but if it is to be redeemed, a religiously inspired moral idealism must aid in the task. A purely naturalistic ethics will not only be overcome by a sense of frustration and sink into despair, but it will lack the force to restrain the self-will and self-interest of men and of nations. If life cannot be centered in something beyond nature, it will not be possible to lift men above the brute struggle for survival. Intelligence may mitigate its cruelties, and prudence may prompt men to eliminate its worst inhumanities. But the increased power which the conquest of nature supplies merely substitutes unintended cruelties for those which have been consciously abolished. Living on the naturalistic level, men are bound to contend for life's prizes and to use physical force in the contest with more and more deadly effect. In short, the moral redemption of civilization must be, at the same time, a revitalization of religion, a rekindling of the connection between our personal everyday world and its ultimate context. To remake this connection between the human yes and the cosmic no is simply to adapt to our environment, like any other creature, only not to a tiny territory, nor even an entire planet, but to the cosmos as a whole. We belong to the total environment, and to redeem our civilization is to enliven that dormant connection between ourselves and the very context in which we live. In the end, the story of life itself is a testament to the fact that there is a real connection to be made here, and a silent demand that is put upon us as human beings to make it. In Heschel's words, "He who has realized that sun and stars and souls do not ramble in a vacuum will keep his heart in readiness for the hour when the world is entranced. For things are not mute, the stillness is full of demands, awaiting a soul to breathe in the mystery that all things exhale in their craving for communion. Out of the world comes a behest to instill into the air a rapturous song for God, to incarnate in stones a message of humble beauty, and to instill a prayer for goodness in the hearts of all men." To be startled by the force of this silent demand is to realize, what is decisive is not the existential moment of despair, the acceptance of our own bankruptcy, but, on the contrary, the realization of our great spiritual power, the power to heal what is broken in the world, the realization of our capacity to answer God's question. What is decisive is the realization of our capacity to answer a cosmic challenge, the realization of our great spiritual power to transform the cosmic no into a divine, eternal yes, to share in the manifestation of the ultimate meaning of existence. In this book, I described the metaphysical logic that justifies this answer, this ideal mode of response to our value problem. But this logic is merely a pointer to a possible experience. It merely suggests a way toward full experience, and full experience transcends the realm of knowledge altogether. A master of this intuitive perception, Heschel makes the point. There is no knowledge that would be an answer to endless wonder, that could stem the tide of its silent challenge. When we are overtaken by endless wonder, all inference is an awkward retrogression. In such moments, a syllogism is not self-evident, but an insight is. In such moments, our logical affirmation, our saying yes, appears like a bubble of thought at the strand of an eternal sea. We then realize that our concern is not, what may we know? Our concern is, to whom do we belong? In such moments, that quality of experience that is outside and beyond the physical universe overtakes us, and the heart of all reality is manifested in our reality. The fact of all existence is manifested in our existence. In such moments, the soul is introduced to a reality which is higher than the universe. Our soul compares with its glory as a breath with all the world's air. We are introduced to a reality the mere awareness of which is more precious to us than our own existence. The thought of it is too powerful to be ignored, and too holy to be absorbed by us. It is a thought in which we share. It is as if the human mind were not alone in thinking it, but the whole universe were full of it. We do not wonder at things anymore. We wonder with all things. We do not think about things. We think for all things. The moral order of the universe means that the great yearning that sweeps eternity is a yearning to praise, a yearning to serve, and when the waves of that yearning swell in our souls, all the barriers are pushed aside. In our world, the people who seek this full experience must ultimately be judged based on their honesty and courage as they navigate the infinite tension of our existence. As Becker put it, the ideal critique of a faith must always be whether it embodies within itself the fundamental contradictions of the human paradox, and yet is able to support them without fanaticism, sadism, and narcissism, but with openness and trust. To conclude on this point, let's reconsider the movement of liberation theology, which emerged around the Christian world in the second half of the 20th century, as discussed in Chapter 6. The rallying call of this movement was, in short, that God is on the side of the oppressed. In the context of this book, that aphorism clearly points to something true. The oppressed person, the person who knows what it feels like to have other people strip them of their value, is, through that particular experience, exposed to the deeper truth out of which that experience emanates, the universal challenge to our value, the cosmic undermining of our ambitions, identity, and existence. If the pain and the power of that experience draws them toward this deeper truth, if it awakens them to the celestial challenge that is put upon us all, yet goes unheard, if it sets them on a journey to manifest the fullness of their soul, then that experience will turn into a source of liberation, a divine, eternal yes. Such a person, it is true, will be aligned with the moral order of the universe. But, again, the principal danger for liberation theology is that it would transpose the cosmic no into the no of the oppressor, that it would encourage a group of people to interpret their value problem as something essentially political, rather than a feature of the structure of reality itself. If the movement veers in this direction, it will try to resolve a cosmic problem with the instrument of politics. It will reduce the infinite tension of our existence down to a form that suits our easy conscience. In the struggle for ethical integrity, it will seek a shortcut to it, and it will therefore devolve, as Becker saw, into fanaticism, sadism, and narcissism. Conclusion. Schopenhauer wrote that in all ages, truth, poor thing, has been put to shame for being paradoxical, and yet it is not her fault. To be a self-aware being in the universe is to live within and against the cosmos simultaneously, to both yield to our environment and defy it at the same time. In all ages, we attempt to resolve this conflict prematurely, to yield to our environment completely, to defy our environment completely, or simply to forget. In this book, I showed how each of these efforts devolve into moral corruption. In our own time, in a world that is rapidly spiraling into forgetfulness and the madness that comes along with it, the author David Foster Wallace said it quite well.
We all worship, and we all have a religious impulse. We can choose to an extent what we worship, but the myth that we worship nothing and give ourselves away to nothing simply sets us up to give ourselves away to something different. For instance, pleasure, or drugs, or the idea of having a lot of money and being able to buy nice stuff.
The moral life is, in essence, a life that is lived upon its ultimate backdrop, a life that is given away to its ultimate context. This book did not offer a spiritual roadmap to the moral life, or a political roadmap to the moral world. What it offered instead was a conceptual framework within which we can recognize the moral ideal and our paradoxical relationship to it. And this, I think, is more important now than a set of personal or policy recommendations. The moral order of the universe means that there is a link between reality and morality. It also means that a false metaphysics will inevitably generate moral corruption, which makes the high level of analysis in this book deceptively practical. At its heart, this was an elementary book about the forces that produced a trouble in me even as a child, though I didn't know how to express it, a sense of the undermining power of the miraculous, and at the same time, a sense of almost total separation from that power in this world, a sense that in this way of life I was inheriting, a vital need of my existence was neglected nearly every minute of every day in the most alarmingly casual way. It is the need for life to unfold on a backdrop deeper than what is humanly contrived, deeper than culture and society. It is the need for us to commune with the very context in which we live. And from that childlike perspective, it could hardly be more evident that both religious and non-religious people corrupt and forget this essential need. And now, it seems to me, that the more this need is neglected, the more desperate human energy is aroused, for which there is no proper outlet. So the whole world is throwing a kind of temper tantrum, and like all temper tantrums, we do not fully recognize the reasons for our fury. This outburst is a demand. For what, we have forgotten. But it is resounding through our whole environment. It is felt by the very context in which we live, which scolds us like a heavenly father when this dome unto itself cracks open and the cosmic no comes pouring through, and quiets us like a heavenly mother, beseeching the very source of who we are to come alive, to spring into new dimensions of awareness. And people will accept that call toward full experience. Amid the confusion, people will bridge the gap between themselves and their own courage, their own honesty, their own faith in the providence of life. Without a doubt, an eternal yes will ring out once again.